Good morning, everyone, and welcome to USIP. My name is Raymond Gilpin. I head the Center for Sustainable Economies here at USIP, and the center looks at the intersection that involves security, resources, peace, and development, and energy resources and energy infrastructure are a critical component of that mix. And this morning we're really privileged and honored to have a very able panel to help us explore some of the vulnerabilities related to energy security infrastructure, and also help us think through some of the smart ways that we could avoid some of the worst of potential threats that energy infrastructure, some of the threats that are posed to energy infrastructure. Energy security is generally on our mind when we think about two things. One, the supply of petroleum or the supply of electricity. And secondly, when we think about the price, the pump price and the global price of these goods. But we don't usually think very deeply about the whole chain that involves extraction, processing, storage, distribution, and transportation. And at many nodes along this chain, we do have certain vulnerabilities that are posed by both state and non-state actors. And this generally concerns us for two reasons. Partly because of the geostrategic nature of energy resources and energy infrastructure. And secondly, because a lot of the supply chain happens in places or traverses places that are particularly dangerous. And so understanding how to preempt incidents of insecurity or attacks, and how to respond to them to bring both the supply chain and facilities up to speed post-attacks is an enduring challenge. And this morning we want to talk a little bit about one attempt to investigate this nexus and to garner information relating to attacks on energy infrastructure dating back 3 decades, what we could learn from that information, and the extent to which we could use it for both policy and operational reasons. We are very pleased to have Jennifer Giroux, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich, and she has led that center's efforts in gathering, analyzing, and hopefully ultimately using this data. She will be our leader of speakers. She will speak for about 20 minutes, talking us through the process, the information, and what has been learned, and try to contextualize the discussion by highlighting data from 2 country cases, Nigeria and Colombia. Following her, we have 2 very able panelists, and the first would be Robert Icord, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department's Bureau for Energy Resources. He's responsible for a very innovative program on energy transformation, and we're very pleased to have him here casting some light on this issue and talking to us about the broader ramifications of energy security, and including the interconnectedness of energy infrastructure with electricity grids, IT networks, and how there's a collectively reinforcing relationship among those, and what we can do as thinkers and doers to help forestall disaster. Thank you so much for joining us. And our second discussant is a long-time friend of USIP. I'm Dr. Paul Sullivan, who is a professor of economics at the National Defense University. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown. He has many decades worth of experience, both here in Washington, D.C. and in the field, researching these issues and also applying some of his findings to real case issues in the Middle East, in North Africa, and across the world. We're very pleased to have you, Paul, and look forward to your comments. Before inviting Jennifer to lead off, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. First is what we like to call the silencing of the beepers, and if you could join me in silencing anything that rings, sings, vibrates, or beeps, not necessarily in that order, and because it interferes with our AV equipment, particularly since we are doing a live webcast. And secondly, before Jennifer speaks, I'd like to thank two people who have been instrumental in bringing this together. Firstly, Marcia Wong, who is our Director for Intergovernmental Affairs here at USIP. She's been very, very helpful in thinking through the issues and also in convening this meeting. And also want to thank Brett Boyle for admin assistance. Without much ado, I'd turn it over to Jennifer, who would speak for about 20 minutes. Unfortunately, we can't project her PowerPoint presentation, but you're receiving copies as we speak. Jennifer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Raymond, for the opportunity to be here and really be in this roundtable and have a discussion on this topic that really crisscrosses so many different dimensions and issues of business and conflict, critical infrastructure protection, energy security, maritime security. So I've already kind of spoken with a few of you in the room, and the representation in the room speaks to how this issue crisscrosses those domains. I'm also very excited to be on a panel with such distinguished scholars and policymakers. So I'm very excited about the discussion. I look forward to critical discussions and critical feedback on what we've been doing in Zurich. This process came about, just a little bit of background. I work for a think tank and research center at the ETH University in Zurich. We do a little bit of policy work for the Swiss government, but we also do a lot of academic research. So we have kind of these links between these worlds. And the research team that I work on, we work on critical infrastructure protection issues, non-state violence, cybersecurity, emerging risks. And so my topic, looking at the targeting behaviors of violent non-state groups, especially in how it relates to the relationship in their operating environment, access to resources and infrastructure, really kind of speaks to the themes that we're addressing in Zurich. And this topic kind of came about years that I was working on databases, the Global Terrorism Database, critical infrastructure databases, and I kept seeing cases, particularly in the Colombia case, where you had these small, frequent attacks rather than the low probability or low probability, high consequence attacks that are always spoken about in risk management. I was seeing small, frequent attacks on energy infrastructure, particularly oil pipelines in Colombia, that led to major disruptions over the mid to long term. So that kind of created some questions for me about how groups in this area were using. And then I started looking at other discussions about, particularly coming from scholars on looking at terrorism and energy security. And I found that, I was seeing a lot of groups in Nigeria and in other parts of the world that weren't being coded in these databases for clear reasons that some of these attacks weren't terrorism. So they weren't being included, but a lot of the groups, the non-state groups today, kind of toggle between these spaces. And the work that I do in Nigeria, you can't really categorize any of the groups there. They, at times, speak to political issues and at times criminal issues. So these were the main issues that I saw with the data. So going forward, we decided to, and what I will talk about in the next few minutes is, I'll give you a little bit of background on the database, the Energy Infrastructure database that we're still developing. We're in the final stages, at least the last 6-month push. I have the code book. I'm going to actually pass that around. And I'm happy to send copies to anybody. I'd love to get your feedback. We engage a lot of experts when developing this code book to get feedback so we could create something that had broad usability. And Looking at developing EAD, one of the things that we saw was a data challenge. So we saw that there's a lot of there's terrorism databases, open source terrorism databases, and then you have excellent reports, news reports that are coming out, and you have the Maritime, the IMB, the International Maritime Bureau piracy report that also captures criminal attacks at energy carriers as well as other types of offshore assets. So we wanted to take that information that's scattered in different spaces and bring it all together and really create the data foundation for doing future analysis. Because we thought if we just use the existing data resources out there, the terrorism databases especially, that would limit the portrait that we wanted to look at, which was really to look at how non-state actors in general, criminal or political, are using the space. So that created the intention to partner with the Paul Scheer Institute, which is I would say it's a research institute also in Switzerland, but they focus on natural sciences, energy issues. So allowed me as a qualitative researcher, someone with an anthropology background, to partner with somebody with more quantitative skills. And particularly with the Paul Scheer Institute, they developed the Energy Severe Accident Database, which looks at accidents like the BP oil spill and looking at the effects of those types of things. So we wanted to create a sort of partnership with that, a complementary to that data set. And so anyways, we are the Energy Infrastructure Attack Database is looking exclusively at non-state actor attacks. It's open source resources that we're using. So we look at news aggregators like LexisNexis. We have all of our research team has Google Reader capturing incidents that are coming up on a regular basis. We use open source databases like the Global Terrorism Database and the Worldwide Incident Tracking System database. And we're looking at attacks that are successful, that are failed, plots, threats, whatever we can grab. And we're also trying to capture cyber incidents, and I'll talk a little bit about that because that's been a particular challenge for us. And the time frame for this has been going on for about 2 years, actually, the conceptualization. So we're in the kind of the final stages of coding, really starting to go through the refinement of data. We still haven't coded 2012, but we've been collecting information on that. And then we hope to launch EAD in its public form in this summer, July, August. And that will be available and accessible to everybody. And the definition that we use for the database is that energy infrastructure refers to human, information, and physical infrastructures in the following core sectors: biomass, coal, electricity, geothermal, hydropower, natural gas, nuclear, petroleum, solar, and wind. And we got a little controversy when we decided to include human assets. But when we started to canvass this phenomenon, we saw that sometimes energy sector personnel oftentimes signified a shift in the targeting behavior of groups and how their environment was changing. So, for example, if pipelines and other physical assets became hardened, then you'd see certain groups start to shift to kidnapping energy sector personnel. But it also speaks to the criminality, the opportunity for criminal gain, for monetary gain, for ransoms. So we decided to include human assets in our energy infrastructure definition. We're going back roughly to 1980. We have a few cases in there from 1970s. We have them, as much as the information's available, but we want a strong data set for 30 years. And non-state actors, regardless of motivation. This was also something that we debated about. We also consulted with experts. I worked on terrorism databases, and for many times we had a really hard time deciphering whether or not certain incidents, especially when you have incidents with an unknown perpetrator, whether or not they could be coded as terrorism. So we decided to remove the motivation as a code, as one of the coding properties, and rather focus on the instruments used and the method of delivery. And we thought that regional experts, case experts, could then pick up this data and create portraits on whether or not these are politically motivated or a combination of different types of attacks. In terms of the cyber incident, this is one of our major pitfalls. I get asked this question all the time: are you coding for cyber attacks in energy systems? And we're having a really hard time with this because we have an actor problem and we have an information problem. Actor problem, a lot of times the actor is unknown. So if we've committed ourselves to developing a energy infrastructure attack database with non-state actors as our core actor concern, with cyber incidents, a lot of times you have assumptions, but you don't really have confirmations. And that ties into the information problem, the lack of information. You know, one of the reports that came up on my docket that might be something we would consider to include in our data gathering process was titled U.S. Nuclear Facilities Under Constant Attack. This came out, and it was referring to cyber attacks. This came out about a month ago, and if you look in this article, you'll see that it doesn't really specify the number of incidents, so how could we code for that? Are we talking about 10? Are we talking about thousands? We have no more specific information. It's not to say that the information doesn't exist. It's being held in certain channels that we don't have access to. So that's been one of our pitfalls, and that ties into what we can talk about later in terms of analysis challenges with the particular aspect. I'll go ahead, instead of talking to you about all the different things we're coding for, I'll just pass this around and feel free to take a look at it. And you'll see on even the first page, we have a list of, you know, our coding categories and subcategories. So feel free to take a look. If you'd like a personal copy, I'm happy to email it to you. I'll just pass it around that way. Okay, so let's get on to the snapshot of the data. If you see on the slide where it says snapshot of the data, that is what we've been geocoding. It's about 70% of the data, and it gives you a sense of kind of the spatial characteristics of the data. And I like this because you can also see the density of attacks. And once the database is launched, we'll be able to do a little bit more fine-tuning of going in and looking at this a little bit more closely. But I wanted to give you guys an illustration of kind of what we're aiming for. You don't see any attacks in the United States, but it's not to say that there hasn't been some. But that's part of the data that we didn't include in this test. But basically, the overview. So if we go with the question, what are the general patterns of contemporary energy infrastructure targeting? And how can we understand them? And that is kind of the fundamental question. And the patterns that we start to see by looking at the data that we've captured so far is that, well, the sky is not falling. We're not talking about a widespread phenomenon. John Robb, he has a blog called Global Guerrillas, wrote a few interesting articles, and also the book Brave New War, talks about systems disruptions and how it's part of non-state actors deliberately targeting infrastructures and critical nodes and things. And I don't see the phenomenon so widespread by looking at the data. What I do see is much more nuanced picture, where you see clustering, contagions of violence in certain regions. We've found about 8,000 incidents so far, roughly between 1980 and 2011. 3,500 roughly of these are in the last decade alone. Now, this could be because media reporting has gotten a little bit better, or this could be that the flashpoints, the critical energy regions, producing regions, but also transit zones, maritime, offshore, and onshore transit zones, are becoming a little bit more stable and a little bit more volatile. So it could be those. We have to look close at the data to see what that's really about. Mainly the targets are oil, gas, electricity, very accessible targets, pipelines, electrical pylons, these types of things, energy carriers, tankers, and these types of personnel. What we also see is that so the characteristics I was initially talking about in Colombia, the smaller, more frequent, constant, regular attacks. Sinai Peninsula in Egypt has had monthly attacks on their gas infrastructure that's really disrupted significantly energy supplies for electricity to Israel and Jordan. In some cases where you have even a tighter clustering, you see almost cases happening on a weekly basis, sometimes almost daily. And this aggregates into large effects in the sense that it cuts down, it disrupts supplies, typically for the region. Sometimes it can have impacts for the global supply. Gas, in particular, is a regional resource, so that tends to have regional effects more significantly. Perpetrator, political but increasingly criminal. Mexico is blowing up literally in the sense of the number of energy infrastructure attacks that are coming out of there. The narco cartels have really diversified into targeting energy carriers, pipelines, and things of that sort. So that's one of the new flashpoints we've been seeing. And overall, the perpetrators are using their geographies. They're leveraging that access. And it comes with a favorable ROI, or mixed return on investment. It can be usually media media impacts. When some of the research that I've done in the Niger Delta, I had one individual in particular say to me in 2010, we're very interested about what's happening in Somalia. We can do piracy like that here, or something to that effect. They were very aware of the number of reports coming out of the large captures of tankers and the huge ransoms that they were bringing. And it's I don't know if it's coincidence, but that Gulf of Guinea has been the flashpoint for maritime piracy in the last year in terms of increasing, not really quite at the rate of Somali piracy, but increasing nevertheless. And a closer look, what I think is really interesting on the data is a closer look are the clusters. So if you see on the slide where you have the data graph, what we see are these little flashpoints, and a cluster can be, attacks that number in close to 100 per year, or sometimes more. And those are it's not to say that other attacks clearly weren't happening in other regions at that time, but those are the main clusters that we see, and it kind of creates like a wave-like phenomenon that we have to explore. So if we are trying to understand these patterns, one of the things that we started to play with is theorizing a little bit about looking at contagions and outbreaks of fads or rumors, social contagions, or in the world of epidemiology and public health. When you talk about diseases and outbreaks, and you can kind of understand where things attack or maybe where things resist. So we've been looking at that as a little bit to try to maybe conceptualize and theorize these clusters or these contagions of energy infrastructure attacks. And I think that's really the interesting thing. Raymond, you mentioned how can we avoid these energy infrastructure attacks. And I don't know if in all contexts we can avoid all attacks, but what I think we would want to aim for is to mitigate the opportunity for these huge clusters, these flashpoints to emerge. And I think that's one of the real things, because then these tactics and these targeting behaviors become viral. They have almost a viral characteristic. And this feeds into my discussion on the cases, Nigeria in particular, and Colombia. So if we take that idea of this kind of clusters having kind of a viral tendency, in my work in research in the Niger Delta, I really saw this firsthand. And how one of the things that people talked to me about there was how during, they had decades of conflict, but it wasn't really until 2006 that energy infrastructure targeting became very intense and a part of the core goals and targeting and tactics of the kind of umbrella group there, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. And that really introduced a new form of insurgency and targeting behavior, a level that wasn't quite seen before. And this changed also some communities where you had kidnapping that was once targeted at energy sector employees, now drifting into the local sector. You really saw the business of kidnapping. So what started as something that was very concentrated in the energy sector started to shift out into communities and affect communities at large. And that really changes certain community norms and behavior. And it's also a little bit more difficult to unwind because you start to create business interests, these gray economies that emerge in these conflict zones that are tied to and interwoven into the energy sector within these regions. And it's impossible, as I mentioned, it was impossible to categorize groups there. I talked to a number of people who, would talk about they'd be hired one moment to participate in violence around elections, other times to be a part of oil theft or bunkering operations, very sophisticated ones. There's thousands of illegal refineries that cover the creeks. And other times they would talk about the political motivated attacks and how that they were fighting for a fair share of the revenues and the environmental degradation. So the groups there have the legitimacy of the political context and the social context, but they also have the criminal motivations of the large oil theft and operations there and things that are tied to the energy sector. And one of the things that we really saw in terms of the viralness is that groups started to proliferate. And I talked to certain people there that would talked about toggling between different groups and spaces. And right now, even though it's in 2009 they were able to contain, there was really a balance of impact and a balance of power on the side of the militants in 2009, and they were able to disrupt that momentum by introducing the amnesty process. That amnesty process has been very tenuous. There's been violence since then, sporadic violence aimed at the energy sector. And I'm watching this area very carefully because if you look on the next map from Le Monde Diplomatique, If you look at the confluence of factors happening in sub-Saharan Africa and up through the northern region, there's a lot of criminal, the fusion of criminal, terrorism, extremism, energy resources, political instability. A lot of those things don't really bode well they maybe create certain risk factors for the future security of this region, but also the security of the energy resources and the ability for them to transport safely through this region. And of course, Sudan is very illustrative of, the oil or the energy conflict symbiosis. So I'm watching this Nigeria case and I'm putting it in its regional context and looking at the different factors there, wondering if we're going to see another wave or cluster or contagion of violence, because in my opinion, the amnesty process, post-amnesty process, hasn't really gone far enough. Secondly, and I'll be wrapping up my remarks, looking at Colombia very quickly. So if we look at these clusterings and we see a flashpoint and then we see a decrease, well, then it can create questions. Well, how did that decrease happen? What were the changes that happened in that community or in that region that allowed for the infrastructure, the energy resources to be able to be produced in a safer environment, and also perhaps a reduction in violence? And the Colombian case provides an excellent case study. There is actually a report that is coming out from, or maybe just came out from CNA. They got their hands on the database of the whole DDR program, looking at interviews with former guerrilla fighters from the various groups there, and looking at what were the reasons for leaving FARC or the ELN or what have you. So it creates a really great portrait of not only the fact of securing the energy assets, but also you have to deal with the groups, the militant groups that are operating, or the criminal groups that are operating in that region. So this case provides a great case study because it shows the importance of partnerships. It wasn't just Colombia that was able to improve its energy picture, but it was also with the work of the U.S. government, also working with the oil companies there, also engaging the host community in certain respects, and of course addressing the decades-long insurgency that had gone on there and really created a lot of instability and vulnerability in this region. And so it really showed the dramatic decrease in attacks as they hardened assets and they also engaged the region. And then you see another cluster emerge in 2008. Attacks start to go up. And that just kind of showed that they needed to, and they're now readdressing or updating their security policies and sending in more armed forces to guard pipelines and things like that. They're just modifying. So, if a cluster if it has a potential to exist in a region and then it goes down, it doesn't mean that you don't have to update policies and standards and engage new partners that are coming into the region. I was doing some work in the Malacca Straits, and I was doing some interviews in Malaysia, and they talk a lot about how the waves of piracy, maritime piracy, will go up or down depending on how robust the Coast Guard efforts are. So if one nation, Indonesia, Singapore, or Malaysia, is backing off a little bit on being robust with their Coast Guard activities or what have you, they'll see different fluctuations of piracy. So it shows that groups are aware of their environment, they're leveraging, they're looking for exploitable opportunities. And just to wrap up, I think these are just some of the initial findings, some of the kind of things we're starting to chew on as we get closer to finishing up this database and trying to make sense of what I think are some really interesting things, the non-event versus the event, looking at comparative opportunities between cases. EAD will be hosted both on its own website, also on another partner website within our ETH University through the International Conflict Research Group. They do some excellent research on conflict research and visualizing conflict dynamics, and they have a great platform that mashes data on armed conflict, ethnic groups, and we're going to incorporate EAD's data into that. And I would like to even see other data, population density, economic growth, governance. I think it would be really interesting. I think that's when you can come in and see some very interesting correlations, perhaps, that you cannot see right now at this moment. A lot of the data gathering, all the reports that I find, I try to create a transparency to the project and post them on our project blog that you see on one of the slides. And what we want to do is have qualitative and quantitative research, utilize qualitative and quantitative research methods to really unpack and scrutinize this data and be able to decipher trends. So this, of course, involves doing geospatial analysis. This, of course, involves doing data mining and really seeing if we can decipher spatial patterns and temporal trends. And on a micro level, it's looking at these clusters, and it's also comparing, in cases where you have similar conditions, where you have a history of conflict and the presence of energy resources or infrastructure and the presence of violent non-state groups, and yet you have no attacks aimed at that infrastructure. Al-Qaeda is a great example of this, where, the affiliates act very differently from each other in this respect, despite calls from, core leadership in the group to attack and target energy assets. So we want to look and scrutinize that a little bit more, because I think that can also inform us about the nuances. And finally, one of the things I've been playing with is, and I mentioned this very briefly to Raymond as well, is can we forecast? Can we my background's anthropology, so I don't have the technical skills to this, but our partners do in terms of forecasting, maybe creating a model that could forecast the potential for energy attack clusters to emerge, or even maybe just certain events. So that's something that was inspired by the multi-criteria analysis tool, the indicator tool that I saw in The Economist last year when the upheaval in the Arab world was happening, and you saw these different indicators and factors that you could weigh and plug in. And it also comes in response to some of the modeling on coup potential. So Guinea-Bissau and things like that. There was a great article that came out just recently, our blog piece, about an individual who was able to assess coups in 2012, and he put a blog post out, and one of his top choices was Guinea-Bissau, which just went through another coup. And it really creates some insight into maybe how we can combine different indicators and risk factors to perhaps create some type of model that could forecast or look a little bit into see if these clusterings might emerge in certain regions. And basically, that is a wrap-up of the project, the database, some of our initial findings and what we're kind of chewing on in terms of analytically, and also our hope for further research in this area. So I thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Jennifer. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we'll have quite a number of questions, and hopefully we'll have more of a discussion than one group talking at the other group. Before we do that, let's hear from our discussants. We'll start with you, Paul.
Well, I have to give the usual caveats. These are my opinions alone, do not represent those of the National Defense University, the government, or anyone else I might be involved with. So now I can speak my mind, and let's see how much trouble I can get into.
Uh-oh.
All right, in response to some of the comments about criminality and terrorism, I call Al-Qaeda Al-Qaeda. It's a mafia. They're involved in all sorts of things well beyond terrorism. With regard to the nuclear power plants being attacked regularly, every nuclear power plant I've visited, it's important to have boots on the ground, have dedicated computer systems that are not connected with the internet. So I'm not sure what they're attacking. Maybe some guy's cell phone? We'll see how that works out. Anyway, with the Sinai attacks, that's rather interesting, because these attacks are not happening inside of Cairo or Alexandria or on some of the electricity generating plants. And that has a lot to do with the crisis center that's in Cairo, run by the military, the SCAF people. They fanned out as the revolution started and immediately started to protect these plants and other facilities and pipelines. But they couldn't protect the Sinai as well. The Israelis have similar issues and similar reactions, albeit a bit more subtle. Ashkelon is an oil port. It's also a major desalination facility. Those are connected. One thing that could be considered for the huge facilities like Abqaiq, the global facilities, is something along the lines of a phalanx system like what we'd have on our Aegis cruisers. If someone wants to go attacking these big facilities, immediately they're nailed, to put it in a very academic setting. All right, incentives and costs are the most important thing. How do you keep piracy from happening? You make it very expensive for them. You give them the expectation that if they try anything, they're sunk. But in Somalia, that's not happening. Osama bin Laden, in his fatwa of 1996, you can look this up afterward, essentially said, don't attack the oil facilities, protect them because that's the wealth of the Ummah. There are various branches of Al-Qaeda that may do different things, but they're pretty much calling themselves Al-Qaeda, and they're not really connected with Zawahiri and company in many ways. You could talk about modeling and data points and doing econometric analysis and all of that, but I'm an economist by training, took a lot of econometrics, wrote an econometrics of the history of India and Japan technological change for my thesis. But the most important thing that I've found in my career is getting boots on the ground, muddy and dusty, and walking around the facilities and seeing what's happening. Then the data points start to make sense. You just can't plug things in and expect to get an answer. So, but clearly this is an important project, and it's a good step, first step. Listing the attacks from open sources is a good step, but obviously other sources have to be used in other environments. Looking into their effects, some of their effects is a beginning. All the way it seems that the way some of these effects are explained, they don't capture much of what could happen in a post-attack environment. Figuring out the predictive variables is probably the most important thing. You want to be able to stop this stuff and mitigate it before it happens, not just write down it happened, check a box, plug it in. It's complicated, but there should be some way by boots on the ground in combination with some statistical analysis and simply intuition. That's another thing I've learned over the years. Sometimes you can take a look at an equation and say, yeah, that's nice, but your gut feeling is, wait a minute here, we have a problem. And that's going to be even more important. Now, it's good to see that these data will be open for researchers, but it's also open for the other guys. And they may be able to put this stuff together. So there may be an important part of this to veil some of the results and analysis, to not exactly have it completely open for people that may use it for their own benefit. Getting more into the effects of the attacks is vital. I teach my students and those people I advise in the government and elsewhere to look at energy systems as systems within other systems, kind of nested. Energy systems are nested within each other, oil, gas, electricity, and so forth. For example, if the electricity is out in a country, the gas and oil cannot flow, and the refineries cannot work. There may be backup power, but that could be a short period of time. We've been so far lucky that a lot of these attacks are kind of short-run effects, but don't bank on it, ladies and gentlemen. That's what's going to happen in the future. Also, if the electricity is out, water processing plants are out, desalination plants are out. Now, if you want to think about the possible results of an all-out war in the Arabian Gulf, think also about desalination, because that's where most of the water for Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar comes from. You whack those plants, and you're going to have people leaving that country, or those countries. UAE and Qatar have 2 days of water reserves. So an electricity attack also means a water attack. There's cascading that goes on here. Also, when water moves uphill, such as in Jordan, where 18% of the energy use in Jordan is for moving water and treating the water, if there's an attack on the very few electricity plants in Jordan, you have an effect on the society as a whole. And Jordan may have a little dicey-ness right now. We'll have to see how that works out. Depending on when these attacks occur, you could have various increasing instabilities. Think the Gulf in August. Anyone who's been in Qatar in the middle of August when it's about 52 degrees and all you want to do is freeze inside of the hotel, which is some of the coldest rooms in the world at that time, then you can do that. Also, energy is connected with communication. Try charging your cell phone without electricity. Of course, in Africa, you use the car battery, which is recharged by the alternator in a truck or a car, but not many places have that available. How many of you thought about charging your cell phone when the electricity goes out in Washington, D.C. with your car battery? There are things you have to do to make that happen. Again, boots on the ground. You can also recharge with solar and wind devices if they're available, and they haven't been attacked either. TV, radio, other information and communication sources can also be shut down. Loss of energy in many places could lead to a virtual standstill of some government activities in some countries, which may be one of the goals of the people who are making these attacks. You have centralized governments as well as centralized energy facilities. This is not a good combination, and for some places that's a good argument for distributed energy, having separated energy systems. Transport obviously can be affected. Those of you who are thinking about the electric cars, think of the following. What would happen if the electricity system went down to transportation networks? Aha. Now also think about the electric car and the smart grid network. Electric cars have computer systems. You plug them into your house to recharge them. Those computer systems can send viruses into the network. Cyber attacks on a smart grid, or even what we usually have, dumb grids, may actually already exist in some places as sleeper attacks that have already been inputted through various things, including a USB plug or whatever. We can't use those anymore for that particular reason. Now, if the electricity is out, give you an example of Katrina, when it shut down the pipeline system coming out from the refineries, which didn't work anymore because they were damaged, and also there were alligators in some of the control rooms. There's boots on the ground for you. The IAEA Treaty of 1973 essentially saved us. The Europeans sent us a lot of refined products. When they did land in our country, the pipelines, even as far as the Northeast, could not work properly, so a lot of this stuff was delivered by truck. How many of you knew about that one? This is how you have to react to some of these attacks. There's cascading effects in many different directions. Electricity is a key connector. Oil and gas are connected with that, nuclear power plants, of course. There's also path dependence that we have to consider. Take, for example, pipelines. If you're going to go after the pumping stations and the compression stations, those are the things that a terrorist or someone who's looking at economic benefit would go after. Not the pipelines. That's easy. You just go out to the warehouse, you get the pipeline, you attach it together. The pumping stations and compressor stations could be out for months, particularly if you hit them in multiple locations at the same time in a strategic manner. Sooner or later, the terrorists and the organized crime folks and all that are going to pick up on the possibility of doing these multiple attacks. And that will not be the best of all possibilities. Thinking about shutting down gas to Ukraine and Belarus and what that did to even the UK. Shutting down the oil in Sudan, how that has thoroughly disrupted that country, both north and south. Shutting down the pipelines from Louisiana and Texas. These pipelines are interconnected, but also they're path dependent, and there aren't that many of them out there. Which leads to another part of this. Why should we just focus on violent non-state actors? The wars of the future will most likely focus on energy and water and transportation, resource wars. Of course, the wars of the far past focused on that as well. Water was a weapon, fuel was a weapon, cutting down the trees near the fort or the castle. But this is the sort of thing that we should expect. Hitting Upcake, hitting Karg Island and Lavan Island, hitting Kabot and Abot in Iraq, essentially shutting down the Iraqi economy. If you really want to read a somewhat interesting article, I wrote something for the National in the UAE a couple of weeks ago, looking at the potential energy impacts of an all-out war in the Gulf and what that would do to the price of oil and the price of gasoline. By the way, our gasoline's cheap. Go to Norway. Go to Turkey where it's $10 a gallon. This is cheap. Let's stop whining about it. But if there's an all-out war in the Gulf, we're looking at $15 to $20 here and probably $30 to $40 in Istanbul. What would that do to the economy? These attacks have a certain degree of merit from the viewpoint of the terrorists and the people who want to make a pile of money at that. With regard to the cyber attacks, think of these systems as SCADA systems, informationally intensive. Some of the most complicated mathematics around has to do with electricity systems. You have to deliver that stuff exactly when it's demanded. Huge linear and nonlinear programs associated with that. You send in the right sort of virus, and you can blow up the system, and you can cause serious trouble. And it's so easy, ladies and gentlemen, that if you want to know what keeps me awake at night, that's one of the 1,000 things. I do a lot of work in the Middle East and Africa. So anyway, I'll wrap it up. If we do not collect and manage data, we don't analyze it in a recursive, nonlinear, complex manner, do all these data tests and all that, and send people to get boots on the ground and mud on their boots, then we do it at our own risk. Whether it's a small village in India or a mega city in the developing world or New York or Los Angeles, these are going to be massive issues of the future. And if we don't start understanding them now, we really don't want to start to try to understand them when it's beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very sobering analysis. Two important things. One was the issue of nested systems, and we'll be very interested to know how you pass the data to reflect the nested nature of not just the problem, but also the clusters. And the second one was the whole issue of interconnectedness and path dependency. When we come to understand how do we use the data, those will also be very important considerations. And I hope we have time to discuss a bit more of that during the Q&A. But now to give time to our second discussant, Robert.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Well, the new Energy Bureau in the State Department is certainly grappling with energy security as one of the key missions that we're concerned with. My role in particular is to look at the issues of the world of the future, the transition and the transformation that is occurring. And there is a major transformation going on in the world energy systems. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and the concept of vulnerability, because I think Paul has laid out many of the issues very well, especially, for instance, the issue of the conflict and the relationship between energy and water. So there are many different kinds of vulnerabilities that we need to consider as we look at the evolution of the energy systems and what are the policy implications. It is clear for those of you that have looked at the World Energy Outlook, 70% of the world's future energy growth is going to be in the developing countries. And a large part of that will be in India and China. So you have to look at the Asia-Pacific region as really critical in terms of how those systems develop, just from a quantitative standpoint. And the whole development nexus and issues and how it relates to conflict then opens up, I think, a whole area of research that is, as you were saying, very important in terms of looking at how are the political and economic systems going to handle this economic growth, energy sector growth, urbanization, and I'll come to that in a minute. And the environmental dimension, to me, is becoming more and more important. And our colleagues at the Department of Defense, I don't know if is anyone here from DOD? They're certainly worried about it. I've talked to enough people that, especially in areas like Central Asia, for instance, where you have this potential for major conflicts. Paul mentioned, obviously, Middle East, where you have these kinds of dimensions. And it's also, it's not just the fact of resource scarcity, but it's also an issue related to the hydrological cycle and what's happening to the hydrological cycle. Because you see clearly where there are years of serious drought, that the cost of the systems go up enormously, so you may have to import a lot more energy. And that the political relationships and the potential for tension between the upstream and downstream areas grows. So as we look at vulnerability, we have to sort of get a sense as to what are the magnitudes of these vulnerabilities. Clearly, we know that if you knocked out some of these major, the Straits of Hormuz, et cetera, you're going to have, in a sense, a very different scenario than one where you're, even blowing up a power plant. And clearly there are flashpoints. I mean, the Bosphorus and the Straits, you mentioned that in your discussions of the Malacca Straits, where I used to do a lot of work in Indonesia, and that's clearly an important traffic way for a transit area that will continue because world growth in oil will continue. And therefore we have to be interested in it. But I want to move to the next topic, which is gas. Because what is happening, and what you see also projected in the World Energy Outlook, is that gas's role will increase significantly in the world energy economy. It's projected to be, in 2035, equivalent to oil in terms of its overall role in the fuel mix, about 23%, something like that. There are lots of new gas fields that are being developed. Just look at East Africa, for instance. And you also have enormous demand growing for LNG, liquefied natural gas. Before, a lot of the focus was on the pipelines from Russia, et cetera, that moved huge amounts of gas. But the LNG business has really grown and was projected to grow enormously in the future. That opens up new supply routes and new supply, scenarios here. Just look at going back to China and India. Okay, they're importing increasing amounts of LNG. And Japan is having to increase enormous amounts of LNG. I mean, who could have predicted the dramatic changes in Japan as a result of that accident? So, our crystal ball is not very good, and there are many kinds of variables that could very significantly disrupt and turn the international energy market on its head. One of the factors, of course, has been the revolution in gas development in the United States. And the potential even in the future, and we'll see. I mean, it's a very important policy issue in terms of exports of LNG from the U.S. But in a sense, but the point is that LNG trade is going to increase. Gas production is more widely dispersed around the world than oil. And a lot of the old major producing areas are declining. So you've got new oil provinces that are opening up, and people are looking at the Arctic and et cetera in terms of where are the new major giant fields that can be developed. But gas, on the other hand, is very plentiful and is being found in all the regions of the world. And we, one of the programs we have is to discuss and share lessons from our gas development experience, not conventional and non-conventional. And so we'll see what that realizes in terms of production and markets. Right now, the markets are very dispersed. Asia market, LNG import market, the European markets with pipelines, Russia gas pipe, and of course the U.S. market, whereas we have historically low gas prices. Reminds me of the time when I'll show my age, when I worked with the Federal Power Commission, was controlling gas prices in the U.S. and we were very, very low. The concern, to some extent, is that prices are so low, we're going to have a major transformation if they stay low for transport in all kinds of areas. And then the issue is the price too low to attract the investment that's needed? But a lot of the investment that's occurring in the U.S. is coming from China, India, South Korea, Japan, major oil importing countries that have particularly significant, especially in the current situation of the sanctions regime. Okay, so LNG is a big issue. Gas is a big issue. It offers an opportunity for diversification. I mean, in real estate, there's a saying, location, location, location. In energy, it's a diversification, diversification, diversification. That's one of the keys to our philosophy, I think, in terms of where we're going. And another, obviously, major driving force is urbanization. And the areas that we see the urban growth is tremendous, and that has obviously is very important implications for energy systems. As Paul mentioned, transportation, smart grids, all those areas. And so urbanization, Africa and South Asia, which are the lowest areas of urbanization, with about 39% urban, they're projected by 2035 to go up to 53% urban. So you've got hundreds of millions of people being added by population, plus you have the urban growth. And all of that related to the vulnerability of those urban systems and the need for investment and modernization to meet the demands of those growing megacities. And coming to power systems, it's interesting because you really have two different directions which things are headed. I mean, one is larger and larger integrated electricity grids. Just look at PJM in the U.S. It's grown enormously. It's a huge area. It's where there is, in a sense, a sophisticated teleinformation system and where you're dispatching power and managing trades, bilateral and all kinds of trades between different consumers, and you're feeding in all kinds of independent power producers and different sources. So the trend is there. We just had an initiative that, fortunately, the Secretary of State and the President and Latin America leaders announced, which was unfortunately not picked up very much in the press, but it was for Connect 2022. That is, in a sense, we've sort of set a vision of trying to have a greater electricity interconnection in the hemisphere, but over the next decade, including access for all to electricity. So you've got that trend. Africa too, Asia, South Asia, et cetera. So that is going to be very important. The role of renewables, nuclear, gas, and that development is very important. Renewables are a big challenge, as you know, because they're mainly intermittent. And therefore, there are lots of vulnerabilities in and risks that are involved in terms of systems that are heavily reliant. One of the scenarios we were doing in the Black Sea region was what happens if the thousands of megawatts of wind capacity in Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey all go out at the same time. The grid will probably crash. So that's the kind of vulnerability that's there. I think the issues, having worked on Chernobyl and all the high-risk reactors in the former Soviet Union, and seeing the devastation in Japan and Chernobyl and elsewhere from a nuclear action, I mean, I think that's one of the things that bothers me, is that even with physical containment like you had in Japan, you had significant radioactive release. So, I mean, you know, there's still some of these old reactors. What would happen if a reactor, for instance, in Armenia had an accident? Doesn't have containment. It would be devastating. And then finally, I wanted to say a word about cost. Clearly, there are trade-offs here in terms of budgets for security versus other kinds of needs, development needs. And I think each situation has to be looked at carefully in terms of what are the strategies to try to reduce conflict and try to mitigate those kinds of situations that are going to lead to opposition and potential attacks on the systems. But I also say that we've already invested a huge amount in that, in one way, in the sense that the countries under the IEA have developed, in a sense, a very, very substantial strategic petroleum reserve of over 1 trillion barrels. So that, in a sense, you know, you can easily, even under some of the worst scenarios, you can see, in a sense, there would be ability to draw upon several million barrels a day. I think, what is it, Paul? We've got about 17 million falling through the Gulf of Hormuz every day. You know, so I think that we need to look at that issue in terms of what are the insurance mechanisms that are in place globally to deal with disruptions, and to ask ourselves what are the needs for further kinds of insurance and security investments. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert, for expanding the horizons on what constitutes vulnerability, and also looking ahead to what sort of threats are we likely to encounter in the coming years, and how do we use the knowledge we have now to prepare, not so much to prevent, because as you rightly pointed out, Jennifer, it's not so much a prevention issue, but how do we A, mitigate, and B, recover expeditiously. I think there were a number of points, two that I'd like to highlight, and the first would be the issue of how are energy infrastructure grids likely to evolve over the short and medium term. You talked a lot about the continental interconnectedness. There's a global interconnectedness, but there's also a case being made for microgrids. And how do we view vulnerabilities when we have this islanding approach to infrastructure vis-a-vis a more complex more complex networked approach? And the second issue that's an important vulnerability consideration are the demographic and urbanization issues that you mentioned. Because normally when we're talking about vulnerabilities, we think a lot more about the physical infrastructure. And the way demographics are changing would also impact these systems. And I'm really heartened to hear, Jennifer, that you did capture human capital to some degree in your database. So we do have a lot of cards on the table, and what I'd like to have over the next half hour is as much of a discussion as we could have, but to allow as many of us to speak as possible, I'd ask that you make your interventions as pointed and as succinct as possible. This is the first, hopefully the first in what might be a series of discussions, so we'll have other opportunities to engage. That having been said, I'll open the floor, and please identify yourself before making an intervention. We'll have a lady.
I feel, first of all, I want to thank you all. This was very remarkable presentations, and certainly timely, and all three synthesized very well in the context of U.S. Institute for Peace kinds of issues. And I guess what I'm wondering is, in the context of the comments that you all made, is when you look at the sort of, as several people have mentioned, the changing universe, if we will, of energy. One is the kind of hemispheric resiliency that seems to be moving forward given the significant increase in technologies in terms of accessing petroleum and, as you said, natural gas, and the questions of whether U.S. would become an exporter or not. And in the context of what constitutes vulnerabilities, I wonder also if remarks could be, if you're including in how you include in the think, the increase of energy resources moving to China, and as there is greater resiliency in the Western Hemisphere and more from the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa moves to China, what are those implications? And in terms of the meaning of terrorism and therefore the anticipation and development and improved capabilities in terms of protecting energy systems and resources, a difference between what might be classically called terrorism in how we are defining it now from 2001, and the kinds of Niger Delta situations with, if you go back to the Ogoni period and what emerged during those periods of time, being in a context that is, I would say, more perhaps specific to those particular dynamics, and then finally, looking at new emerging situations, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, coastal Namibia offshore petroleum development, and one has, in fact, if I may, a capacity for prevention by doing it right, to the extent that the small acts, and I use that in quotes, the small acts being different from the global scale acts, and not to try to conflate the two. And I guess I'm just wondering what the think is in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have the gentleman here, and then the gentleman ahead, and then I'll turn to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Ted Wynn. I'm a researcher here at USIP. And there are a few things mentioned, demographics, the intersection of conflict and development, and vulnerabilities. And what I didn't hear mentioned was the massive amounts of coordination between states and energy corporations and investors, political compromises, which, if you look at security, you can look at it in a short term, medium term, long term. So I'm not sure which, I assume we're looking very long term. I mean, that might be wrong, but my question is how the legitimacy and the stability of the state that would house these energy infrastructures, how that legitimacy really could, if a state is more legitimate, it's less likely to be politically attacked. I guess that's my succinct way of putting it. And so perhaps that might be something, the database to think about. And I think it might also, in the context of security, legitimacy is, a legitimate state is going to more likely be a secure one. So I was wondering if you could talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So,
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Manish Puri. I'm with Recorded Future. I am very excited to see this database and the results. I want to ask you questions about the data, but I'll wait for that. Comment and a question. You talked about forecasting, and I was thinking about some of the leading indicators that might be there, and not dissimilar to his question. I wonder if in epidemiology they do the patient zero analysis. Where did it start? And so what I think may be difficult, I was looking in your code book, and one of the things that occurred to me is that there's sometimes attacks that are coded as multiple attacks or as one continuous. And you may, with the benefit of hindsight, be able to go back and say, those were actually coordinated. They actually presaged what was happening here. And so I think that's a challenge for the database in a way to be able to code that allows you to go back, because you're not going to go back and recode 30 years of things, but how do you account for that? And that's also to your point about forecasting, because I think that ostensibly could be a leading indicator. And that was, I think, sort of your point as well, is that the presence of multinationals and their approach and their political risk assessment could be very much a correlate to what attacks may happen. So they're also taking out the motivation. I think that's interesting, but also a challenge too, because that's how you add that layer of texture to the forecasting. Not to plug, but my company does predictive analytics around unstructured data and forecasting. So take open source analysis and say what's coming up ahead and aggregate those forecasts. So love to see your database. Thank you.
Thank you. A number of issues, and I think I'll pass them out as follows. There was one question on the direction of trade and the global energy industry as it relates to more energy ostensibly going to China, and what impact that has, not just on trade, but also on the supply chain. And I think I'll ask you to handle that one, Paul. Then there's also another question on definition. How do you define terrorism? And also, how do you more appropriately define the various indicators in the database? And so there are the questions relating to data definition, data identification. Of course, Jennifer, that would be yours. There's an interesting comment about coordination among all stakeholders, state and non-state, the viability of the state, and also capacity for prevention, which I think was the first question. And Robert, if you don't mind, I'll dump on you, because I think they're all connected in one way or the other. So maybe we can start with you, Paul.
Well, nothing like having some easy questions. Of course, the famous baseball player Yogi Berra said that it's difficult to predict stuff, especially about the future. And things can happen rather quickly, and personalities can define how things happen, and there are certain events, I guess now they're called black swan events. In econometrics, they're called dummy variables, pretty much showing how dumb we are about a lot of the stuff we think we know. But just taking a look at what happened in the Arab Spring, there were small events that led to earthquakes. Often unpredictable events. That fellow in Tunisia gets slapped in the face and they take away his fruit stand. There we go. Roller coaster coming for the next 10 years maybe. Very difficult to figure out where this stuff is going. In India, the Amritsar massacre, General Dyer, it galvanized the country against the British. Who would have predicted that? Except for maybe the folks who were having martinis with the general the night before. It's just these things that happen offline that can throw things off. It would be very nice and clean to be able to judge through trends and macro and micro trends what's going to happen next. And to some extent you can in many countries, but it's going to be very difficult to do that in certain circumstances. For example, if we were to take a look at the food price that people in the Arab world were facing in 2008, and then look 2020 hindsight, you would see that there's something adding up here. And also, all of the countries that landed in the Arab Spring took the subsidies off of electricity, of water, of food, and many other things, and the people started to get rather poor rather quickly. So that makes sense. Incentives, economic stuff, getting people to move in that direction. With regard to the potential that the United States could be an oil and gas exporter, that's possible. Gas is probably going to be a lot easier, but we're looking at trillions of barrels of oil in the ground in the United States in the form of oil sands, oil shale, and shale oil. The last two being two different things, by the way. One is kerogen and the other one is oil locked in the shale. Massive reserves. We could become the Middle East very easily if this is done properly in an environmentally sound manner and so forth. And we could reduce, first of all, our imports of oil. We don't import that much natural gas. Trinidad and Tobago and Canada, that's about it. But also, which people aren't talking about, particularly our presidential candidates who are thinking in the next 4-minute CNN, Fox TV cycle, is that we could get rid of our debt. That's another issue. You tax all this oil, you just write it off. End of story. It won't be that simple because of the politics and dysfunctionality of Washington and some of the states, but that's something else. Now on to China. China is quickly growing. Some would think that it's overheated. Some in the Chinese government look at it that way. It is overheating. They're trying to slow it down by changing their interest rate structures and making loans more difficult. They're going to look at a housing bust pretty soon. At least that's what people are talking about. There's great inequality within the cities and across the country, west and north versus southeast. There's a huge water problem in the country. There may be a growing legitimacy issue in the next few years that the government and we and many others will have to take a look at, because if that becomes an unstable situation, that could be more than just interesting, to put it calmly. They're importing a lot of LNG. They're building a lot of LNG plants very quickly. And many wonder whether they're being built in the safest manner. The nuclear power plants that they're thinking about, it's a lot faster than we ever built them. And there's a lot of pushback from various sources to just slow down things. But during a meeting between Hu Jintao and President Bush and the President of China asked each other, what keeps you up at night? President Bush said terrorists, and Hu Jintao said 25 million jobs. They have to bring this energy in order to keep people employed. They have to keep on developing. Population growth rate's not that high, but 13 million new people every year means you have to get people jobs. And of course, there's frictional unemployment with that as well. And there is a huge roaming group of unemployed in the country. Actually, the roaming unemployed in China could be as great as our entire labor market. And there are a significant number of increasing demonstrations throughout the country because of land, water, food, and employment issues. So one would hope, and for the betterment of the world economy and security, that China will develop appropriately and we will not see instability. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, let's look at this more carefully. How would that affect energy markets? It could affect them significantly. It could be a real shock to the system if anything happens rather quickly. Certainly on the demand side, it could be a real shock to the system. And not just for those exporting from the Gulf or possibly our gas exports and oil exports to China, but also to Central Asia, which has recently built major pipelines coming in from Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan into China. As the people in the Middle East would say, inshallah, this will not happen, but that's not exactly a strategic policy. And if I could just touch a little bit on the state legitimacy on another side. The private-public development in Central Asia and Russia has been changing over the last few years. And that could affect how that area develops as well, and also how security of energy systems are developed. And I think I'll stop there. As you can imagine, I could talk about this stuff for the next 10 hours and not get tired, but I'll.
Thank you. Robert?
I think clearly we don't have the luxury of just looking at the long term. We've got to deal with the short and medium term, and we are trying to do that. But I think that some of the aspects of your question relate to obviously this issue of governance, legitimacy, transparency. These are very important, in fact, in the structure of the new Energy Bureau at the State Department. So we have my team that's involved in the energy transformation, but we have the energy markets team that's working on very hard on the day-to-day market issues, and then we have a team that's working on governance and access and the whole extractive industries initiative and other things. So that, and I've been very much involved in working on the on U.S. involvement in the Sustainable Energy for All initiative of the Secretary General, because he's put forward a challenge to try to provide universal access for electricity to the over 1.4 or more people that don't have electricity now, and modern fuels. And so I think that is certainly one of the indicators of the development and of participation and opportunity for growth is related to the issues of access for much of the world. And I think that the issues of reform in the countries and the ability to overcome some of the vested interests, to have policies and reforms that are going to be more directed toward productive growth and access for the poor is one of the central challenges that we need to focus on. But clearly, in terms of the issue of economic and democratic development, the question of the governance and the legitimacy of the regimes is very important.
Thank you. And that's a really difficult one to pass, the governance and legitimacy. An example I usually give is if you just survey the Arab Spring countries, think about the type of governance that existed in Tunisia, vastly different from Libya, vastly different from Egypt, vastly different from Yemen, both in terms of the system of governance and the governance in infrastructure, but yet they all fell. And so being able to, with some degree of precision, determine what constitutes state legitimacy is very difficult, especially if you're thinking about possibly using it as an indicator or leading indicator in a predictive model. But we do have a lot of people who are thinking deeply about these things and finding ways that you could dummy. Not necessarily because we're dumb, but because it's a variable of convenience. But it is necessary, but as he rightly pointed out, it's a very difficult one. Data issues, Jennifer.
Okay, I just want to pick up really quick on the comment about nested complex energy systems. And one of the things that we found in the data is when we see a shift in a decrease in attacks on, say, oil pipelines and whatnot, one of the things we saw in Colombia was in a shift to hitting electricity infrastructure, because the groups knew that if they hit that electricity infrastructure, that it would cascade into other failures. So it depends. Again, it's much more nuanced. You don't see this happening in all cases. And then that begs the question, why? How do the groups interpret their strategic environment? What are their relationships with their host community or even with the energy companies and whatnot? So, but in the certain case of Colombia, and also, I mean, when you asked that question about legitimacy, I was going to say, well, what's your definition? What do you refer to? And I think one of the things you can also see from Colombia, but also perhaps Algeria as a case model, is the aspect of coordination between the state and the energy companies that are operating there and other actors that are operating there. And I think it presents an interesting case study in looking at the importance of stakeholder coordination and in keeping attacks to a minimum. They happen in Algeria very rarely, or not that often, and they are able to keep them at a pretty low number in Colombia when they have robust security measures. So that aspect of coordination is definitely, there's case studies to get some insight on that. In terms of the definition and the discussion you asked about with terrorism and all these events that we're looking at as it relates to violent non-state actors, and you're absolutely right, Paul, there obviously is a state component. So, having a bigger picture is certainly important. But all these attacks and these threats that emerge in these zones, they happen in a political context. And certainly they emerge in the sense of grievances, very legitimate grievances, usually in the sense of not feeling that they have, either they want sovereignty or revenues or economic development or every number of things. And so you can label things. I come from the world of counterterrorism, and I worked in this area, but as I got on the ground and doing field research, I saw a lot of fluidity. And so then labeling, I thought, rather than labeling something terrorism, which is a tactic of political violence, rather we can take that out and use that for expert analysis that can then look at the data and then create case portraits about what exactly is going on here. So it's not just to say what the perpetrator is or the attacks that are, the targets or the methods being used, but then really using expert analysis to peer in deeply and say, well, are we seeing incidents of expressions of political violence? Are we seeing expressions of criminality? And if we're seeing expressions of criminality, how does that sustain a level of instability in the zone that could perhaps bring about another phase of political violence again? So I think the definitional thing is interesting and intriguing, but it's not something that we're focused on with this particular data set because of the challenges that emerge with it and the various ways you can interpret that. And then you're absolutely right also about doing it right in Namibia, but also Ghana. Africa's exploding in terms of resources that are being discovered. Kenya, Mozambique, is happening all across the continent. So there are a lot of lessons learned, I don't like that, but ways in which that can be informed in how to do it right in those environments. And it certainly, requires coordination and work by just partners on the ground, whether it's from U.S. government or other countries, but also the energy companies and the host community. That's a very important partner. The host community is a very, very important partner. I think that did I hit all the comments?
No, I think you did. And your point about complementing the data with expert knowledge is is spot on. The issue of coordination, particularly when it comes to energy infrastructure, is pretty complex because the supply chain is quite extensive. It involves, as you rightly pointed out, the companies and the governments, legitimate, depending on how you define it. But if you look at the companies, you have national oil companies and privately owned companies. They behave differently. Some have stakeholders, others have shareholders. If you look at the companies themselves, the private companies, you have the MNCs and the mid-caps and the smaller ones. And they all own different parts of the infrastructure. And how you get enough granularity in the data to understand this connectivity, and also what you need to do to forestall or mitigate the threats is, what this discussion is all about. But I think assuming that we just have, broad sets of stakeholders, I think would lead us down the wrong path. We really have to pass the stakeholders out to then understand what does coordination actually mean when we're talking about energy infrastructure. And we hope that in subsequent meetings we'll be able to look at this with a bit more specificity. We do have less than 5 minutes left. I saw, I think, a couple of hands go up. If you promise to give us 30-second sound bites, we'll have enough time for you to speak, and then the panel will have time to wrap up. So I'll ask the gentleman there and the lady here to make your way to the to a microphone and give us a 30-second soundbite. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Jonathan Morgenstein, and my question is, this might be a bit macro for this discussion, but if a lot of the discussion is focused on fossil fuels and especially expansion of the possible resources here in the United States, the types, tar sands, et cetera. And fossil fuels tend to be centralized in their dissemination, which seems to be the subject of the discussion, the vulnerabilities that creates, and the resulting exacerbation of global climate change and the conflict drivers that exacerbates. All of that leads me to believe that going down the road of expanding fossil fuel exploration and utilization seems to make all of those problems worse. And shouldn't the focus more be on renewable distributed generation that you all touched on, but didn't seem to be as much of a focus as it seems that would lead the conclusions of your statements to be? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent question, ma'am.
My name's Kate Walters. I'm a recent graduate of GW's Middle East Studies program. You mentioned the threat of resource wars or violence, and I've done some research on Syria and Turkey where that threat didn't play out, and I wondered what are the situations where there is resource shortages causing violence, and if you found that to be interstate violence or non-state actors. Thank you.
Okay, two very interesting comments that I hope would be reflected in your closing remarks. I'm going to give each panelist about 2 minutes, a couple of minutes to wrap up, and we'll start our way at the end and work our way down the panel.
Well, I'm glad you raised the question about the alternatives, because obviously they are very important. Their share is projected to increase, renewables. But I would really highlight in my closing remarks the importance of energy efficiency. There are no scenarios to, in a sense, mitigate climate and environmental impacts that don't involve a major role for energy efficiency. And I think that the Secretary Chu likes to use the example of refrigerators. That if you had the same efficient refrigerators now as you did, in the 70s, you'd be using 7 to 10% more electricity. So I think as we look at the tremendous growth of energy around the world, particularly in the emerging and developing countries, we've got to make sure that the energy efficiency is really a top priority, try to mitigate some of that demand, which then will mitigate the need for so many power plants or oil and gas production, although we need them all. But on the other hand, it seems to me that it tends to be a challenge to get people to focus on energy efficiency, unfortunately. One of my colleagues says we shouldn't talk about energy efficiency, we should talk about energy exploration. That is, we know that if we invest in more efficient buildings, and in India, 70% of the buildings that are going to be in place in 2030 haven't been built yet. And if India accounts for a third of future world energy demand, you can see what the impact could be from lighting and improved buildings. So rather than sort of, so if we talk about avoiding, we have secure returns from those kinds of investments, assuming you have the right policy, regulatory, and other framework and business climate to make those kinds of investments. So I think I would say that these different options are very important, but I would say that we've got to give more attention to energy efficiency. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, I would certainly agree with you on the energy efficiency issue. You could be taking a look at $3 trillion in the ground. There's the old adage of economists that there really shouldn't be a $20 bill in the ground because somebody would have picked it up. No. Because we're looking at massive returns to energy efficiency that people are not picking up. With regard to the oil and gas exploration and climate change and the risk associated with that, most of these issues are going to be related to transportation fuels. And we really have to make some very difficult trade-offs. This is not simple. Has climate change occurred in the past? Is it happening now? Obviously happening now. That's a big question that some people can debate forever. In Europe, that debate is over. In this country on the Hill, the debate hasn't even started, nor do they even want to talk about it, it seems. But if you want to take a look at the Sahara Desert, underneath it is many trillions of meters cubed of water from a time period when it was a lush area of tropics and oceans. And there was an anthropologist from the University of Michigan who found an entire whale skeleton in the Sand Sea in western Egypt. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, does it? Unless at one time it was very different. Climate change, has that headed toward conflict? One word, Darfur. And I can go through history and spend the next 10 hours talking about other examples of it, but it's there. The pastoralists, the problem with feeding the cattle and the sheep and the camels and so forth, and the rains going bad, and then war breaks out, and look at the horrible result of that. But again, this is not easy. There are a lot of emotional trade-offs. Some people put a lot of weight on the science of climate change. Others dismiss it. A lot of people put a lot of weight on employment and economic growth and less on other things. This is going to be a very complicated political process, and we have to work it through as a people. And right now, we're not working through anything. Where's the energy bill? Where's the environment bill? Where's any bill other than the dollar bill that people are getting calls for?
Thank you.
How do I follow up with that? I'm not an energy specialist. I kind of toggle in this world a little bit. I come from the area of violent non-state actors research and terrorism in particular. So, there have been attacks on hydropower that we have in our database, but looking ahead in the future, I mean, again, it's about these groups operating in a certain context that somehow they're, factoring in they're influenced by their environment in very dynamic ways. So location of resources, what are their motivations or goals, their core interests, what is the investment and security of the surrounding environment. So where can they attack things very easily and get the type of response they want, whether it's monetary gain or communication, or what's a host community, like a lot of different factors. And if you look at renewables and you look down the road, I mean, maybe instead of primarily oil and gas and electricity being the core targets, maybe we do see things where you have more attacks aimed at renewable resources like wind. And, in the sense of when you talk about tar sand development and shale gas, things that can have potentially strong environmental backlash. There may be other groups that emerge within North America that already actually exist and kind of have rumblings, where that might be something that we see in the future that emerges. So I kind of engage that I want renewables, I want more energy efficiency, but that doesn't, in terms of how groups target and how that influences them, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I don't really have anything to add in terms of resource. You said exactly. We see this also in northern Nigeria, where the shortage of land, arable land and things like that is putting pressures on competing groups. And so that's manifesting in other ways. How we see that in terms of like energy, like oil, gas, this type of thing is another story. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And just to add to that, USIP recently published a special report on climate change and resources in Nigeria. And if you go to our website, that's the International Network on Economics and Conflict, we do have a number of resources that focus on this nexus. And just very quickly also on the renewables question. Yes, we are thinking broadly, but another kink in this whole discussion would be there's a difference, as you rightly pointed out, between fossil fuels in terms of their geospatial characteristics and renewables, because in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of research that has correlated the geographical location of fossil fuels and the type of violence you're likely to see. And the question would be, when this transformation that includes more renewables happens, what would this do to that dynamic? And how would we be able to understand violence then? So those are important issues that we want to continue discussing. And I think the operative phrase there is continue discussing. And I'd like to thank our panelists, particularly Jennifer, who's from the other side of the Atlantic, but she's been very gracious in sharing her research. I hope we've had a bit more insight into her work, and that this discussion has kind of got our creative juices flowing about ways in which A, the database could be made stronger, and also B, we could use it for both policy and operational uses. Thanks once again to you, Marcia, and to Brett for all your hard work, and thank you for joining us. And in closing, join me in thanking our wonderful and expert panel.